All right, welcome back to the AppMaker for Jira tutorial series. In this video, we're going to be going over one of the more powerful features of AppMaker for Jira, which we call data objects. So, data objects are a way for you to store data from external systems inside your AppMaker for Jira instance, and then access and use that data inside your app you're making with AppMaker for Jira. Now, the concept of taking data from external systems, pushing it into your Jira site, and storing it inside AppMaker for Jira is a really important concept to understand when it comes to AppMaker for Jira, because it's how a lot of the more powerful functionality of AppMaker for Jira works, and it's how we are able to offer a capability which solves a lot of the really complicated sort of security and privacy concerns that often happen when you're trying to integrate different systems. Because you don't necessarily want, say, Jira being able to pull data from other systems, because that means you have to expose like APIs, that kind of stuff. But it's much more safe for you to allow those systems to push data out via something like a webhook and then store that data in Jira and then just access it locally from your AppMaker instance. So we're getting over data objects. This is one of several more advanced concepts, and we will be going through these over the next sort of series of videos. I'm going to give you a little bit of a background, though, on how this stuff works. And just a quick heads up, this is a little bit more technically complicated than some of the previous sections. You don't need to know how to code or anything like that, just to be clear. But it would be helpful if you had a basic understanding of, say, JSON and how something like a REST API works. So how to make like a GET request to a REST API. If you don't know how those things work, just jump into our documentation. We have a bunch of links out to really simple, easy to understand videos, which will teach you how stuff works. If you're not familiar with this stuff, it can sound scary, but it's really not. You can learn the basics of what you need to know in probably 10 to 15 minutes. And we have worked examples of everything on our documentation. You do not need to be a technical power user or a developer by any means at all. If you understand how to use Jira, you definitely have the technical capabilities of how to use this stuff. So just jump into our documentation and have a look. All right, so I'm going to go over some concepts, and I'm going to jump into the documentation directly here to go through some of this stuff. So the first thing to understand is that there is a kind of traditional model when it comes to getting data from external systems and showing them inside another system. And that this is a traditional model that basically all tools or all apps traditionally have implemented, but that traditional model has some issues. So that traditional model is what you would call the request response cycle, a request response loop, which means that your app who wants to display some data from an external system, let's use a CRM as an example here, will request that data from the CRM, and the CRM will respond with the data that was requested, assuming that it is available and assuming that your app has permission to access it. Now, that's a lot of assumptions, and this also has a lot of issues and a lot of flaws in this model. So the first is around security. Now, if say, that external service, that CRM, is actually behind your firewall, you would need to open up a hole in your firewall to allow your app to call into your CRM to get that data. And that obviously is a security concern that a lot of companies really don't want to allow. They don't want holes in their firewalls. They don't want any incoming connection from an outside system to pull data out, because it is quite a large security risk. Instead, you want those internal systems to be able to push data out to the thing that you want to display it. So in the context of us, you might want your CRM to push data up to, say, Jira and AppMaker for Jira when that data changes and when it's relevant. And that way, nothing can going to pull data from your external system, from your internal systems. Only data that your systems want to be able to make available can be pushed out by them. The other major issue with this model is performance and load. So this request response cycle will happen every single time your app needs to show that data. And if you want your app to be showing real-time live data, that means every time you load the page, your app would be calling to your, say, CRM to be like, hey, give me this data. And that could be across thousands of users, across thousands of Jira tickets, and your CRM is just getting hammered with like thousands and tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of requests for this data, and your CRM just falls over and crashes because it can't handle the load. So ideally what you want to do is you want to push that data from your CRM out to Jira and AppMaker so that it only ever needs to be accessed once, not, say, thousands of times every time page loads, and then we just load the data from the database that we have inside AppMaker. And in that way, AppMaker is able to cache that data and sort of serve it locally from Atlassian's own servers, but only the data that you want to make available. You don't expose anything other than the data that you want to make available. So this is one of the core problems that AppMaker is really designed to solve for larger, more complex organizations. It allows you to have this sort of dynamic, flexible content, these apps that can access data from your internal systems without actually having to expose those internal systems to the outside internet, because those external systems can push the data into AppMaker rather than AppMaker having to pull the data. So if you ever hear us referring to our model being a push-based model rather than a pull-based model, that's what we mean, is that we work on the assumption that other systems will push data into AppMaker, and AppMaker does not have to go and request that data to be pulled into it, like what we traditionally. And this is much more secure and gives you much, much more control over where your data goes and who has access to your data. All right, so we're going to work through an example of this implementation using the data objects feature. The data objects feature allows you to create a single object in AppMaker that has a name, and it can store data. It can store any kind of data, and it can store any structure of data. It doesn't really matter. The main thing is that data objects are really useful in scenarios where you have a single unique instance of a type of data. So to give you an example, there might be the information about your company. It might have a name, it might have an address, it might have like a phone number, but you're only ever going to have one instance of your company. So a data object is where you have one instance of a thing. If there are multiple instances of a thing, say you want to store a list of all of your customers' companies, but you want to have the same sort of say name, address, phone number for each of them, you would use a data list. Because a data list is designed to store multiple instances of data that have the same shape. A data object is designed to store a single instance of data. You'll understand the difference more later as we go through it, but just understand that data objects are for a single instance and data lists are for multiple instances. Otherwise, they work relatively the same way. So for the sake of this example, you are going to need admin access to your Jira site. You're also going to need a basic API client. Now, again, if that sounds scary, please jump into our documentation and read up on the basics of REST APIs. Again, it's 10 to 15 minutes of video content on YouTube. It is very, very easy. If you can use Jira, you can make an API call. Trust me. So we're going to be using a tool called HTTPy. It is free. This is what it looks like here. It's just a web-based tool. Anyone can access it, and this will just allow you to make basic API requests from your browser. We're going to be working through an example here with AppMaker for Jira, where we will be creating kind of a fake system status tool. Say it could be something like status page or something like that, which tracks the status of, say, an API or a website that your company manages, and maybe it shows that in a widget inside Jira. So an example of what you might use this could be something like if you had Jira Service Desk and you want to be able to show your service agents like a real-time feed of the status of, say, like your website or maybe like your order management system, so they can help customers if there's any problems. You could use a custom app with AppMaker like this to get data from your uptime monitoring system, like status page or whatever, push that data into AppMaker and then show that as a real-time feed inside Jira Service Management so your agents can see what's going on. And because that data gets updated on a push-based model, that external service, say status page, will push the data to us every time it changes, and it'll be effectively a live feed, but you won't need to have that load being placed back on your status page instance, or you won't need to expose your status page instance to the outside internet. Now, just to be clear, this is just one example. There are literally millions, effectively infinite numbers of ways you could use this. It's entirely up to your imagination. But the purpose of this is just to provide you with a single example so that we can work through how the data object system works. And then we'll have a bunch of examples that we'll publish on our documentation site. And you will be able to go through those yourself. But this is just going to be one. And we're not even going to be using a real status page system. We'll be kind of be faking that using the HTTP client I mentioned before, HTTPy. All right. So the first thing we're going to do is we need to create the actual system status widget itself that we are going to use to show the system status to our users. Now, we're not going to be showing this in Jira Service Management for this video, but just know that this works exactly the same in every single type of Jira site. So it can work in Jira software. So you could have something there for your developers. You could be showing Jira. You probably wouldn't want that on the Jira issue. You might want that as like a project page, and we'll show you how to create those later. But you will most likely want something like this into your service management. But like I said, there are infinite number of ways you could use this, and many of them would use different modules, but this core workflow of getting some data from an external system, pushing it to a data object, and then showing that inside the UI will be the same for all of those different versions. So we're going to go into custom apps. We're going to go and we're going to delete the old stuff that's in here we don't need anymore. And we're going to create a system status widget that's just going to be empty for the time being. So we're going to go new. We're going to delete the placeholder component, and we're going to grab the system status widget. And obviously, if you aren't aware, all of this template JSON, is available on our documentation site. So I am just literally copying and pasting from there. You can do that yourself and hit format to make sure it's all nice and formatted. And you can see here already we have the system status widget starting to come alive. So you can see on the live preview, system status is already there. Great. And there's no errors. We're moving along. All right. So inside this system status widget, we want to show some information to our support agents to tell them what the status of our system is, so that if a customer, say, rings up or gets in touch with us and is like, hey, your website isn't working, or maybe I can't place an order, your agents can see what the status of your systems are and can maybe help the customer know that, yep, sorry, we're having an outage on our website right now. Try again in 5 minutes. So to do that, we want 2 fields in our system status widget. We want one to tell the status of the website. We want one to tell the status of our API for our order system. So I'm going to grab those here, and I'm going to put them into the children list on the stacked information group. And again, you'd see this is kind of, the formatting is not great. So I'm going to hit format, so it's nice and easy to read. And you can see here from the we've already templated some data here. Now, this is a little bit different to the previous video where we were templating data from the Jira issue sort of top level space. So if you look at this, there's different sort of words, and they're split by dots. So each dot is basically saying that you're referencing a nested property of something. So if we were to use the UI component here as an example, component data would be what we call an object property, because it's a property which has a name and has an object as its value. So if I wanted to access the type within component data, I would go component data dot type, because it's saying dot basically says go inside this object and then look up the thing with the name type. So what we're seeing here is for this value, we want to look up data objects, which is technically it's what we call a namespace when we're doing templating. So there are several namespaces for data templating. One is Jira issue, which we used in the previous video, which allows you to access data from the currently displayed Jira issue. And another namespace is data objects. So we're saying go and look up the data objects that are being stored inside OutMaker. From there, we're going .site. So we're saying look up the data objects that are stored at the site level, which means these are available across the entire Jira site. Now, it's important to note that that data objects can also be stored at the project level. So they're not always stored at the site level. They can also be stored at the project level, and they can even be stored at the issue level if you want to get that precise. But in this context, we're looking at the site level. But that might say data objects.project. In this context, it's data objects.site, which means that these issues are this data object is available everywhere. And then we're going to say .system status, which is the name of the actual data object. And then we're saying .website, which is the property within that object that we want to access. So to review, we're saying look up the data objects that are available to the whole site that have a name of system status, which will be, at this point, it's a unique object, so only ever one, because AppMaker will force this to be unique. And then inside that data object, so this is the actual data object, like kind of address, get me the field with the name of website and put the value here. And similarly down here, data objects.site.system status, that's the same. Get me the field with the name of API and put the value for that here. All right. And again, we go over all of this in detail in our documentation to explain to you exactly how this all works. So I'm going to hit save. And if you're not quite following along, just keep with us. Just sort of follow along, because it makes a lot more sense once you've actually gone through the process and you see that coming. Like, okay, cool, I get it now. So if you're still not 100% confident, don't worry. Just stick with us, follow along, and you understand it all by the end, because it all come clicking together and it'll be fine. Sometimes these things are easier to understand, like in retrospect, as strange as that might sound. All right, so we created the system status widget. We're going to go to here. We're going to look at that now. So we're going to open up test issue, and it'll load over here because we created that in the Jira issue context module. Cool, great. So yeah, so system status, and we have the website, we have the API. And now this is currently empty because we haven't got any data here at the moment. There is no data object that has data being populated into it. So we need to create that data object and put some data into it so that it will show up here. Now, this is the part where we need to use that API client. Now, normally what you would do is you wouldn't have a person sending data to AppMaker with an API client to populate into here. That would be a bit redundant. You could just go and hard code that. But what you would do is you may have something like a webhook from your system status tool, like status page, or you might have a webhook from your CRM system. And that would be used to detect whenever some value in that system changes and push that data across to Jira and store it inside AppMaker, because AppMaker has its own separate database that lives inside your Jira site. So the data is still safe and secure inside your Atlassian instance. It's all stored in Atlassian's platform, but we have a separate database which is on kind of to the side of like the Jira issue database, so it doesn't clutter up things like your custom fields. You don't have to create custom fields for every single one of these things. You can just store your own data inside AppMaker. Okay, so to do that, we now need to create the data object. So I'm going to close this, and I'm going to go to back to the apps section and go to custom apps, and we're going to go to a new tab, one we haven't looked at yet. So we're going to go back to here, and then we are going to have a look. You'll see here, there's this data objects tab. This is actually from a previous thing. I'm going to delete that because we don't want that anymore. And this is now empty. And now we're not going to do anything on here. You could actually go and create a data object manually here. That is something you can do. You can just go here and you could go and add it in automatically. But we're not going to do that because we want to show the kind of full actual workflow as if it was being done from an external system. If I can cancel, I'm not going to create it manually through the UI, although you can do that. You can also edit them through the UI. We're going to go to this last tab, which is APIs. And you see here's a lot of URLs. Don't get overwhelmed by this. This is just all the different APIs you can use to programmatically push data into AppMaker for Jira. This is much more advanced capability. So if this is sort of like intimidating you a little bit, don't worry. You don't need to use this stuff. But it's actually very simple, and you will sort of work your way up to working with this stuff eventually as well. Okay, great. So what we need to do is we need to find the UI component to update a data object. So that's this one here. So you have data objects, and you go update data object, post, great. So I'm going to copy that, and you just click it, and it'll copy it automatically. And I'm going to jump across to our HTTP client. So HTTP or API client, to me, what we would call. Now I'm going to add this into the URL. There we go. Now the first thing I'm going to do, if you look here, is you notice that says post next to it, which means this is a post request. It's a post endpoint. So I need to change this from get to post. Now, if you're not super familiar with APIs, what that means is a get request means I want to get some information. Can I please have some information? A post request means I want to send some information. And because what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to send information into my Jira site and into AppMaker for Jira, I want this to be a post request. All right, now I need to add a body to this request. I'm going to go across to the body tab here, and I'm going to change this to be text JSON. Good. All right, which is what most API requests always are. And then I'm going to copy a blob of JSON from the AppMaker documentation. So again, All of this is available in the documentation. You can just step through it step by step. We have all of the JSON and everything already there for you to just copy and paste. Paste that in there. Cool. And we're going to walk through this. So we have here action set. So there are two possible actions in this context when you're working with data objects: set and delete. Set is what it says. It's going to set some data in the system. Now, that may be creating that data if it doesn't already exist, or it may be overwriting that data if it does already exist. And we do the work of figuring that out for you. You don't need to think about whether the data it exists yet or doesn't exist yet. You just go set, and we will figure that out for you so that the data stored in AppMaker is always the most up-to-date version of it. You don't need to think about it. Later on, when you're working with data lists, you'll learn about two other actions, but for now, you just need to know it's set and delete. All right. So the next one is resource type. So this is how you determine where this data object is stored. So remember before we said that there was data objects.site and data objects.project. Well, if you wanted to store a data object against a particular project, you would change this to project. And that would allow you to store data at the project level. And so if you had some data which was specific to a particular project, but you didn't want to make it available across your entire to your site, you would set that at a project. And if you did set that to project, which we're not going to here, you would need to add another property here, which would be resource key. And this would be telling the system which project you want to add the data to. And so for us, it would be like AMT, because that's the name of our, that's the key of our project in Jira. So if I show you here, your AMT, that's our project key. So we'd add that there. Now, we're not going to do that in this context. You could also add issue here, and you could store a data object against, say, AMT-1. And that way it would only be available in that issue. And so you could use this in a context where you want to add a bunch of custom data against, let's say, a bunch of different Jira issues. So we're not going to go through use cases for those right now. They're much more specialized. Just know that you can do that. You can store data against projects, and you can store data against issues. Mostly you will work with site and project level, but in more advanced use cases, you might also store data against issues. But we're not going to do that right now. We're going to go back to site because it's the simplest, because you don't need a resource key for site because you only ever have one site. And finally, there's the actual title itself. So title, system status. Cool. So what we're basically doing here is we're saying we want to create a data object, because you can see here in the URL, data object update. We're going to set the values in it. It's going to be at site level, and it's going to be called system status. Great. Now, notice that this system status and this site are the same values as what we use here, site and system status. So we're basically telling the system we want to create this data object, data objects.site.system status. Data objects.site.system status. Great. All right. So what do we want to put in that object? Now, we're going to hard code this right now, but if you were sending this from another system, you would make this dynamic. I'm going to go data object. Great. And then format that, and we're going to go there. And then we're going to say, well, there were two properties we wanted to access. One was the website property, and there was the API property. We wanted to access those properties and show them in the UI. So we'll go website, and we're going to go API. And then what we're going to do is we're going to put some information here. Online. We're just going to put a comma. I'm going to say offline. Great. All right. So we now have our data object. And so this is what's going to get stored inside AppMaker, and this is what you will be able to then pull the data from in your UI widget. So we're going to say, we're creating a data object. It's going to be at the site level, so we've got system status, and it's going to have two properties. One will be website, one will be API. Website will have a value online, and API will have a offline. And the idea here is as the status changes, you would have your system status monitoring tool push the new status into AppMaker, and then we'll show it in the UI. So we're going to hit send, and you wait a little second. And what this is doing is it's sent the data to us, and it should have been stored. Great. So success, you know it's success because it's green, says 200. Oop, that was not what I wanted to click. And then you'll see a response. And this is really useful because it tells you a lot of useful information about what you just sent. So cool. Outcome, data object updated. Great. Data. And it shows you the actual whole data object here. So this is the actual object that was stored. So site, title, last updated. You can see there's conditions, which is empty. There's all this stuff, which is empty. This is just set automatically by the system. You can ignore it. We'll go over what this means later on. And then there's the actual data object itself. You can look at and confirm that's correct. And then down here, there's this DB key. And so this is useful sometimes. This is the actual kind of like unique identifier for the data object that is stored in our system. You don't need to worry about that, but it can be useful later on in some scenarios. Now, I'm going to pause for a second. For the next minute or two, I'm going to talk about something a little bit more advanced. And you can just completely ignore this if you are a bit more sort of unfamiliar with this topic. If you're comfortable with things like APIs and webhooks and stuff like that, you probably noticed a problem here, which is we're talking about you having an external system like a CRM sending data to AppMaker via webhooks and storing it, and then we can show that in the UI. But you probably also noticed that this is a very specific structure that is unique to AppMaker. And you've probably noticed, or you've probably realized that external systems that are sending data to AppMaker are not going to send it in this format or this structure. And so you're probably asking, well, how do I get those two things to marry up? And it's a legitimate question. And there is a solution for it. It's very easy. We've got it all built into the system. The solution to that is a feature we're going to go over in the next set of videos, which is called a webhook transform. What a webhook transform is, it's a tool that allows you to receive a webhook from an external system in whatever format or structure they send it, as long as it's JSON, and then transform that into the structure that you need it to be in for AppMaker to store that data and for you to use it in our system. So it basically removes the need for any kind of translation layer in the middle. And it's probably, once you get into the more sort of like powerful and advanced features of AppMaker, it's probably the most powerful capability that AppMaker has, because it's really the missing link that so many app building tools don't have, is this ability to just receive a webhook from any system and then transform that data into the shape that is needed for our system. So we're going to go over that in the future video. If you have no idea what I'm talking about right now, don't worry, just follow along. You don't need to understand it right now. And for those of you who are maybe a bit more advanced to going, how is this going to work? You now know that there is a way to make that work. It's very simple, and we'll show you that in the next video when we get onto it. All right, so we're going to hit back to Jira now. So we've sent some data to Jira. We've created our widget and everything. So if I go back to the project, I open up an issue. Ta-da! You can see here now that the system status widget, which was previously blank, is now populated with data. It now has online for the website and offline for the API. And what it's done is that data was stored in a data object inside AppMaker, and the widget now retrieved that data and is showing it in real time. And now this is live. This is a real-time feed because the external system would be updating the data in AppMaker every time that data changes. But you don't need to have our system pull the data out. So you don't need to give it API keys. You don't need to have holes in your firewall and things like that. The data is just pushed out and stored here. All right, so great. We have the data here. We want to update that data. Let's say that your monitoring tool, say status page, has detected that one of the status of one of your systems has changed. Your API is now back online. How do you update this widget? Well, you would get your system status tool to send another API request to AppMaker and update value. So to simulate that, we're going to go back to here, and we're going to change this to online. Pretty simple. And we're going to hit send. Cool. If I go to quickly change this to JSON, let's hit target updated. They're now both online. And if I go back to here and I refresh the page, you'll see here now that both of them are online. And you can also do things like add conditional formatting here. So that if it's online, it's green, and if it's offline, it's red. All information on how to do that is available sort of in our documentation. But the main thing you can see here is that these are updating automatically in real time based on those API requests coming through. The data is being stored inside your Jira site, inside AppMaker. So it's all being safely secured inside the Atlassian platform. None of it is being stored by us in our systems. It's all being stored in Atlassian's systems, but it's not clogging up your issues with, say, custom fields and all other kind of mess. It's being stored in a separate database sort of off to the side. All right. So how do we remove these data objects from the API? From AppMaker. So let's say you don't want to have these data objects around anymore. You're not using the widget anymore. You want to remove it. There are two ways you can do that. So you can go to apps, and you can go to custom apps, and you can go to data objects, and you can just hit delete if you want to. That's perfectly fine. And that will delete it from the system. Same way you could do if UI components and anything else in here. Now, but it's useful to know that anything you can do through the UI, you can also do through the API as well. So what I could do is I could just go here, I could hit set to delete. And I could hit send and it would delete it. I could actually remove the data object thing. I don't need that anymore because we don't need to know that information in order to delete it. What we need to know in order to delete it is what the resource type is and the title. Now, if the resource type was project or issue, we would also need to know that the resource key, because what we do from that information is we sort of generate this DB key and we delete whatever has the same DB key as the matching item. So if I go here and delete the system status object at the site level, send that, and we go here, outcome, data object deleted, cool. And if I go back to custom apps, so I go back to AppMaker here, that is now empty again because we've deleted the data object that was storing the data. So there's now no more data for it to show inside the widget. So I'm going to now go on to a slightly more sophisticated example in the next video, which will be showing you what we talked about before in terms of the data being scoped to a particular project.